Humanity's origin may have begun with a rebellion among the gods. Could the ancient inscriptions carved onto Mesopotamian clay tablets actually preserve hidden accounts of prehistoric alien visitors? When we peel back the layers of Sumerian mythology, we discover something astonishing. Perhaps humanity was never an accident of natural evolution. Perhaps we were deliberately designed by higher beings to serve as a workforce. And the beginning of it all starts with a group of lesser gods known as the Igigi, who rose up against the rule of the Anunnaki. As someone fascinated by ancient civilizations and the origins of humanity, I've always believed that the myths we dismiss as legends may actually preserve our oldest prehistoric memories. And the Sumerian cuneiform tablets may be the key to unlocking them. Today, we'll follow the trail left behind in those ancient texts, step by step, to uncover the cosmic rebellion that changed humanity's destiny and the astonishing secret behind our creation. Hello everyone. You may be wondering, who exactly were the Anunnaki and the Igigi? According to the Sumerians, they weren't simply mythical gods. They were real beings who walked among the world and possessed extraordinary power. The name Anunnaki literally translates as those who came down from heaven. Even the name itself suggests they were not native to Earth, but a royal lineage that descended from the distant stars. Together, they formed a divine council of hundreds of gods. Nominally, its leader was the sky god Anu, but the true rulers of Earth were his two sons, Enlil and Enki. The rivalry between these two gods would become a driving force behind everything that followed. If we compare the Anunnaki hierarchy to a massive interstellar corporation, then Anu would be the chairman, far away at headquarters, rarely involved in the daily operations of Earth's branch. Enlil would be the uncompromising CEO, a strict believer in hierarchy and order, holding absolute authority over life and death. Enki, on the other hand, would be the chief scientist and technical director, a master of wisdom creation, and what ancient texts called magic. He was more compassionate and valued life itself. The Igigi, by contrast, were the frontline workers at the very bottom of this cosmic enterprise. They were young servants of the Anunnaki, described as the younger generation of gods within the Mesopotamian pantheon. Even today, scholars still debate the origin of the word Igigi. Some believe it comes from a Semitic root, meaning watchers or witnesses. Others interpret it as those who observe or those who keep watch. But regardless of the translation, one thing remains the same. The Igigi served the Anunnaki. They were the primary labor force responsible for extracting Earth's resources. According to the legends, the Igigi were described as beings unlike ordinary humans. Their sole purpose on Earth was to mine gold for the Anunnaki. They were stationed far above the Earth, beyond the reach of mankind. Some researchers believe these descriptions may refer to orbital platforms, similar in concept to modern space stations. There, the Igigi processed minerals shipped up from Earth, transferred them to larger spacecraft, and ultimately sent them back to the Anunnaki homeworld, Nibiru. Simply put, the Igigi were alien laborers, sent to Earth to do exhausting work, and they did it for centuries. Can you imagine it? Even gods, according to these stories, could eventually be driven to rebellion by endless labor. The Igigi became the perfect example. In the Babylonian epic Hypotheses, which also recounts the Great Flood, Sumerian paradise is described as a great garden, and within that garden, the Igigi were forced to dig canals, excavate the land, and carry out countless engineering projects. The tablets record it this way: when the gods labored like men, their burden became unbearable. Their toil was endless. Their suffering knew no end. Meanwhile, The higher-ranking Anunnaki placed every difficult task onto the shoulders of the Igigi. Though divine by nature, their existence became harder than that of mortals. Day after day, the relentless labor eroded their obedience and slowly ignited the desire to rebel. Just as workers pushed beyond their limits will eventually lay down their tools and demand justice. The Igigi, after centuries of endless labor, finally rose up. They burned their working tools, a symbolic act, much like workers today destroying the very equipment used to exploit them. Then, under the cover of night, they surrounded Enlil's palace, forcing the authoritarian ruler to confront the anger of those beneath him. That raises an important question. Why didn't the Anunnaki simply crush the rebellion? The answer is surprisingly simple. The Igigi were still gods. They could not simply wiped out. Just as a company cannot fire every frontline employee without collapsing, the Anunnaki faced the same dilemma. If their only workforce had turned against them, Earth's entire resource extraction system would come to a halt. With no solution, Enlil called together the highest council of the Anunnaki to find another way, and it was then that Enki proposed an idea that would change the course of history. He suggested creating an entirely new kind of worker, a being capable of carrying the burdens once borne by the Igigi, yet lacking the consciousness of a god, a being that would not resent its labor, and would never organize a rebellion. In simple terms, he proposed creating a lower-tier workforce, obedient, capable, and easy to control. That new creation would become humanity. You might think that humanity's creation couldn't possibly have been that simple. But according to the Sumerian texts, the creation of mankind was nothing like the familiar image of a god casually shaping humans from clay. Instead, it reads far more like a carefully planned biological engineering project. Leading that project were Enki and his mother, Ninhursag, also known as Ninmahor Mami. She was regarded as the divine engineer of life. The pressure on this project was far greater than we might imagine. The Igigi rebellion was still fresh. The Anunnaki's mining operations had ground to a halt. They desperately needed a new workforce to fill the gap. For Enki and Ninhursag, failure was not an option. The experiment had to succeed. And the materials used to create humanity held an astonishing secret. According to the tablets, they weren't made from clay alone, but from clay combined with the essence of a god. The cuneiform text state explicitly that Ninhursag mixed clay with the blood of a god named Wheeler, then fashioned the first human being. This god possessed wisdom and divine nature. Yet he was deliberately sacrificed so humanity could be created. His blood, according to the story, became the source of human intelligence and consciousness. This detail has always puzzled mainstream scholars. Why would creating a workforce require sacrificing one of the gods? If this were only symbolic mythology, why describe the process with such precision? The tablets even record the god's name, the mixing of his blood with clay, and each step of the process. It doesn't read like symbolism. It reads almost like a laboratory report. Supporters of the ancient astronaut hypothesis offer a very different interpretation. In their view, the clay did not represent ordinary soil. Instead, it symbolized the genetic material of early hominins already living on Earth. The divine blood, they argue, represented the genetic material of the Anunnaki themselves. Under this interpretation, humanity was the result of an advanced genetic engineering experiment. The Anunnaki combined their own DNA with that of early humans, creating a hybrid species, part human, part divine. Whether or no Tone accepts this idea, it does explain many of the unusual details found throughout the Sumerian texts. Even more intriguing, the experiment wasn't successful on the first attempt. According to the stories, Enki and Ninhua endured a long period of trial and error. Their earliest creations were deeply flawed. Some couldn't hold food. Some couldn't bend their knees. Others suffered from severe physical defects. These failed creations filled Ninhursag with compassion, because she realized that even imperfect life could still feel. It could suffer. It could become confused. It could experience pain. That compassion would later become an important thread in humanity's story. Eventually, after countless attempts, the experiment finally succeeded. The Sumerians called mankind Lulu, a word commonly understood to mean a mixed being. The name itself points directly to humanity's nature, a fusion of divine blood and earthly clay. Humans could walk upright, understand complex instructions, perform difficult physical labor, and reproduce on their own. From the perspective of the Anunnaki, it was a perfect success. Their labor shortage had finally been solved. The mines reopened. The canals were dug once again. Earth's resource operations returned to normal. And the Igigi, freed by humanity's creation, returned to their stations high above the earth. Once again, they became Earth Watchers. But this time, they no longer labored. Instead, they silently observed everything unfolding below. They watched their rebellion give birth to an entirely new species, and they watched that species begin its own journey. Have you ever wondered why humans feel such a powerful attraction to the stars? Could that longing the lingering mark left behind by the divine blood described in these ancient stories? According to the Sumerian texts, life was no paradise for early humanity. Although newly created, humans were not treated kindly. Instead, they simply became the Anunnaki's new servants, living the same life the Igigi had once endured. The Sumerian records never romanticized their condition. Humans worked the mines, cultivated the fields, built temples and towering ziggurats for the Anunnaki. They dug vast irrigation canals, transforming the floodplains of Mesopotamia into fertile farmland, laying the foundation for the world's first great cities. Yet none of it was done for themselves. Everything existed to fulfill the role they had been created for. Labor, long hours, heavy work, demanding masters. That, according to these accounts, was the reality of early human life. Some interpretations suggest that the Anunnaki designed humanity with exceptional endurance, allowing people to quietly endure hardship without resistance, almost like machines programmed to obey, following instructions without question. But according to the story, the Anunnaki overlooked a crucial detail. The divine essence placed within humanity was more than genetic material. It also carried a spark of divine consciousness, and that spark could not remain dormant forever. Over time, it would awaken. That awakening came far sooner than the Anunnaki expected, and it was far more powerful. Humans began to dream. They began to question the world around them. They found themselves looking toward the night sky, feeling an unexplainable longing. A longing even they could not understand. Like children searching the horizon, certain their true home lay somewhere beyond. According to these traditions, that was the legacy of Enlil, the sacrificed god. The greatest gift they left behind was not strength, but consciousness, a deep structural memory buried within the human mind, a memory of the stars, a memory that humanity might once have belonged to something greater. Generation after generation, human awareness continued to grow, like a seed buried beneath the soil, pressed down by immense weight, yet destined, one day, to break through the surface. And as humanity awakened, the Anunnaki grew increasingly concerned. especially Enlil. As the strict defender of hierarchy, he recognized the danger first. The human population was expanding far faster than expected. Each new generation became more capable, more intelligent, and harder to control. You may wonder, if the Anunnaki created humanity, why would they fear its growth? The answer, according to this interpretation, is straightforward. To Enlil, humans were tools. A tool's value lies in its usefulness, not in its independence. The moment a tool begins to think for itself, or even challenge its creator, it becomes a threat. The Sumerian texts also describe another complaint. Humanity had become too noisy. The growing population filled the earth with constant sound, disturbing Enlil's rest. Many readers dismiss this detail. Why would a god be bothered by noise? It seems almost absurd. But viewed through the ancient astronaut hypothesis, the passage takes on a different meaning. The Anunnaki were not omnipotent, supernatural beings. They were physical beings, with physical needs, just like humans. They could be disturbed. They needed rest. The only difference was that their technology and abilities far surpassed those of early humanity. That superiority was why they came to be worshipped as gods. To Enlil, humanity's rapid growth and expanding awareness were no longer simply an inconvenience. They represent a population that was becoming increasingly difficult to govern, a population already learning the skills its creator had taught it, and slowly beginning to explore knowledge that lay beyond its intended limits. In Enlil's eyes, humanity had become a ticking time bomb. It had to be stopped. So, according to the story, Enlil launched a series of efforts to reduce the human population. Much as humans today might attempt to control an invasive species, he first sent plague, hoping disease would dramatically reduce mankind's numbers. But humanity survived. Then came drought, destroying crops and threatening their food supply. Humans adapted, learning to store water and cultivate hardier plants. They survived again. Next came famine, designed to force humanity back into dependence upon the Anunnaki. Yet once again, people endured, helping one another through hardship. And each time, Enki intervened. He warned those humans she favored. He shared knowledge that helped them survive. Again and again, he becometh counterbalancito Enlil's harsh policies. Because to Enki, humanity was not a disposable workforce. It was life he had personally created, and life, he believed, deserved protection. But with every failure, Enlil's patience grew thinner. Plague, drought, famine. None of them had solved the problem. They treated the symptoms, not the cause. If humanity was to be eliminated, he concluded, only one solution remained: a complete reset. That solution, according to the ancient texts, was the Great Flood, a catastrophe powerful enough to erase the entire human race. When Enlil presented this proposal before the sacred council of the Anunnaki, the assembly erupted into fierce debate. Much like the boardroom of a powerful organization facing an extreme decision, opinions were sharply divided. Some believed the plan was too cruel. Others insisted there was no alternative. Some feared the consequences. Others argued it was the only path forward. In the end, Enlil prevailed. The decision was approved. Every god swore an oath of secrecy. No one was to warn humanity about the coming flood. Enlil understood that if even a single human received advance warning, the entire plan could fail. But he underestimated his younger brother, Enki. Enki had always possessed an unusual talent for finding a path between rules and compassion. He would not openly violate the oath, because doing so would bring judgment upon himself. But neither would he stand by and watch his own creation be destroyed. So he devised a remarkable solution. Instead of speaking directly to a human, he spoke to a reed wall. In ancient Mesopotamia, reed walls were everywhere. On the opposite side of that wall stood a man. The Sumerians called him Ziusudra. The Babylonians knew him as Atrahasis. Later in the Hebrew tradition, he would become Noah, a righteous man quietly chosen by Enki. Enki's actions appeared accidental, but they were carefully planned. He knew Ziusudra would overhear every word, and he knew this wise man would understand exactly what the warning meant and what they needed to do. Ziusudra did not disappoint. After hearing the warning, he began constructing a massive ark. It was not simply a boat. It was designed to become a moving fortress of life. It would carry his family, along with the seeds of every living species, preserving the world's biological heritage through the coming disaster. What is especially remarkable is that ancient accounts from different cultures describe the ark in strikingly similar ways. For centuries, this consistency has inspired scholars to investigate story through archaeology, geology, and ancient history, searching for evidence that such a vessel may once have existed. When the ark was finally completed, Ziusudra, his family, and the preserved living species boarded the vessel. Then the Great Flood began. According to the story, the catastrophe shattered the face of the earth and forever altered human destiny. The flood was described as far beyond anything we can imagine. Ancient texts say the waters rose without stopping, covering fields, villages, cities, and eventually even the highest mountains. The world became a single endless ocean. The human civilizations, governed by the Anunnaki, with its strict hierarchy, vanished beneath the floodwaters. Those who never reached the ark were swallowed by the rising sea, leaving behind only silence and death. What's even more striking is that the Great Flood is not unique to Sumerian or Babylonian tradition. Similar accounts appear throughout the Hebrew Bible, ancient Greece, India, China, the traditions of Native American peoples, Australian Aboriginal cultures, West Africa, Southeast Asia, and many other civilizations. Again and again, the same core elements appear: a catastrophic flood, a righteous man receiving advance warning, a great ark preserving life, survivors who begin a new world. For many researchers, this remarkable consistency across cultures is difficult to dismiss as coincidence. Some see it as evidence that behind the legends may lie a real prehistoric event. As for what actually caused the flood, opinions differ. Some believe it reflects an enormous natural disaster. Others connect it to rising sea levels at the end of the last ice age. Still others, following the ancient astronaut hypothesis, suggest the Anunnaki may have triggered the catastrophe using advanced technology. No definitive answer exists, but few deny that the flood story marks one of the greatest turning points in humanity's ancient past. When the waters finally receded, one of the most moving scenes in all of ancient literature unfolded. It also revealed a surprisingly human side of the Anunnaki. When Ziusudra left the ark with his family and the preserved living creatures, the first thing he did was build an altar. He offered animal sacrifices, and the smoke arose toward the sky. The ancient texts say the gods smelled the aroma of the offering and gathered around it like flies. It is an extraordinary detail, one that challenges our modern image of distant, all-powerful gods at that moment. The mighty Anunnaki appeared not as untouchable rulers, but as beings who hungered for food. According to the story, the flood had devastated not only humanity, but also the Anunnaki themselves. Human beings had been their primary providers of ritual offerings, With humanity nearly wiped out, those offerings had stopped. And without them, the Anunnaki also suffered. In these traditions, they were not supernatural beings beyond physical needs. They required sustenance, just as humans require food and water. Even more moving is the portrayal of emotion among the gods. Ninhursag, who had helped create humanity, is described as weeping throughout the flood, mourning destruction of the children she had brought into existence. Even those gods who supported the decision are said to have looked upon the ruined world with profound sorrow. Only after the destruction did they realize that what had been erased was not merely a population, but countless living beings, lives they themselves had once created. When Enlil and discovered that humans had survived, his anger erupted immediately. He demanded to know who had broken the sacred oath and revealed the secret. His fury came from a failed plan, a broken vow, and perhaps most of all, from seeing his authority challenged by his own brother. Like a hunter who discovers someone has quietly released the prey, Enlil could do nothing to hide his frustration. But reality could no longer change. The flood was over. Humanity had survived. The world had entered a new age, surrounded by the aroma of roasted offerings and the silent disapproval of the other gods. Enki told his brother that what was done could not be undone. Perhaps, he suggested, it was finally time to find a different way to deal with humanity. After the flood, the relationship between humanity and the Anunnaki changed fundamentally. Direct rule gradually gave way to indirect control. It was almost like parents realizing their children had grown beyond constant supervision. Force alone could no longer govern them. Instead, guidance would replace direct control. According to these traditions, a new covenant was established. The gods promised never again to destroy humanity with a flood. And the rainbow behemoth, symbol of that promise, no longer simply a natural phenomenon, but the sign of an agreement between gods and mankind. That covenant also meant that Enlil's preferred solution, wiping humanity out and starting over, was no longer an option. If the Anunnaki wanted to maintain control, they would have to find another way. According to this interpretation, they established a system of sacred kingship. They selected human rulers, bestowed upon them divine authority, and made them mediators between the gods and mankind. These kings were not gods, but they ruled by divine appointment. They answered to the gods, built temples, maintained rituals, organized labor, and continued serving the objectives of the Anunnaki. In modern terms, it marked a shift from direct ruler to indirect governance. The Anunnaki believed this system would allow them to maintain control over humanity indefinitely. Instead, it began of the end of the age of the gods. Because authority had been entrusted human rulers, those rulers understood human society far better than the gods themselves. Over time, they gradually transformed borrowed authority into their own authority. They stopped seeing themselves as representative of the gods, and instead began ruling as masters in their own right. According to this interpretation, the humans who survived flood were not a random group. They had been deliberately preserved by Enki. Within them, he believed, survived the genetic and cultural heritage worth saving. Not only the original design of the Anunnaki, but also, according to the theory, the later genetic influence of the Igigi, along with the enduring desire for freedom and self-determination. That desire, the story suggests, would pass from generation to generation, driving human civilization toward independence. Later, according to another tradition, The Igigi would once again change the course of human history. Having regained their freedom through humanity's creation, they remained high above Earth, watching everything unfold. They watched the Anunnaki enslave humanity. They watched humans repeat the same suffering they themselves once endured, and they felt deep compassion. After all, they too had spent centuries performing endless labor under demanding masters. They recognized their own past in humanity. In many ways, humans had even less than the Igigi, less divine power, less divine awareness, yet they suffered just the same. Eventually, according to the story, some of the Igigi made a remarkable decision. They descended to Earth once again. This time, they did not come to labor. They came to share forbidden knowledge. Knowledge that would eventually allow humanity to break free from servitude. According to this interpretation, human civilization did not accelerate through slow, independent discovery alone. It advanced because knowledge was given to humanity. That gift shattered the Anunnaki's monopoly over learning and gave humanity the foundation for independence. One of the texts most frequently cited in support of this idea is the ancient Book of Enoch. There, 200 watchers gather upon the summit of Mount Hermon. Together, they swear an oath to descend to Earth, take human women as wives, and share their knowledge with mankind. These watchers are often identified with the Igigi. According to the account, the knowledge they brought was anything but trivial. They taught the working of metals, how to mine ore, smelt metal, and forge tools, weapons, and useful objects. Human productivity advanced dramatically. They taught astronomy, allowing people to track the movements of stars and planets, measure time, and navigate across the Earth. They taught advanced agriculture, soil management, irrigation, and crop rotation, making possible the rise of great cities and growing populations. They introduced the foundations of writing, showing humanity that symbols could preserve ideas across time and distance, allowing knowledge to survive far beyond human memory. They even taught medicine, helping people understand plants, their own bodies, and the ability to heal. In short, according to these traditions, the Watchers shared everything they knew, knowledge the Anunnaki had deliberately kept hidden. Because, according to this theory, the Anunnaki understood one simple truth: knowledge is power. A work forced that knows only enough to perform its assigned task will always depend on its masters. Controlling knowledge was the foundation of their rule. The gift of the Watchers destroyed that foundation. Even more troubling, from the Anunnaki's perspective, the Watchers also took human wives, and their descendants were born with both human and divine blood. These offspring became known in Hebrew tradition as the Nephilim. Many later myths remembered them as giants, beings of extraordinary strength and intelligence, far more difficult to control than ordinary humans. To the Anunnaki, this crossed a forbidden line. The Watchers had violated the established order, sharing divine knowledge with those who were never meant to receive it. Their union with humanity made the offense even greater. As a result, according to these traditions, the Anunnaki condemned those who had descended to Earth, and the actions of the Watchers set the stage for yet another great conflict between humanity and its creators. As humanity continued to develop, its progress far exceeded what the Anunnaki had expected. Humans were no longer a race that simply labored without question. They now possessed their own ideas, their own skills, their own communities. And according to this interpretation, that pushed the Anunnaki's concern to its highest point. Humanshu understood metallurgy could forge weapons, which meant they could fight back. Those who mastered astronomy could travel farther, venturing beyond the regions. The Anunnaki could easily control. Those who learned writing could record laws, agreements, and history, creating political systems that no longer require direct supervision from the gods. They were becoming capable of governing themselves. Meanwhile, the descendants of the Watchers continued establish powerful communities of their own. Their growing numbers placed increasing strain on available resources, making Themven more difficult for the Anunnaki to manage. Simply put, humanity was approaching true independence. A civilization capable of feeding itself, governing itself, defending itself, and organizing itself would no longer remain under Anunnaki control. Once again, Enlil saw a threat. In his view, human civilization had drifted too far from its original design. Another intervention was necessary. This time, his concern extended beyond ordinary humans. It also included the hybrid descendants, the Watchers who had shared their forbidden knowledge. According to this interpretation, humanity's first attempt at building an independent civilization directly to another famous story, the Tower of Babel. Many people see Babelus nothing more than a lesson about human pride, but through the ancient astronaut hypothesis, it becomes something very different, not merely a construction project, but a technological one. Ancient Hebrew texts describe humanity's goal as reaching the heavens. Within the worldview of the ancient Near East, heaven was understood as the realm of the gods, the domain of the Anunnaki. Under this interpretation, the true purpose of Babel was to reach the level of humanity's creators, to free mankind from Anunnaki authority and become fully independent. When the Anunnaki saw what humanity was attempting, they became deeply alarmed. According to the biblical account, they declared, "Now they are one people with one language. This is only the beginning of what they will do. Nothing they plan will be impossible for them." Supporters of this theory see those words as revealing the Anunnaki's true fear, not human pride, but human potential. A united civilization, sharing one language and one body of knowledge, could eventually achieve anything. It might even challenge its creators. So, rather than destroying the tower, the Anunnaki chose a far more effective solution. They divided human language, one common tongue became many different languages, communication concepts, cooperation became difficult, the united civilization fragmented, and construction of the tower came to an end. At first glance, the intervention seems simple. But according to this interpretation, it struck at the very heart of civilization. Imagine it a king, a perfectly coordinated team, and dividing it into countless groups, none of which could understand another. The Anunnaki understood that humanity's greatest strength was never the individual. It was collective cooperation. So rather than controlling individuals, they disrupted the network itself. Different peoples retained different pieces of knowledge, but no single civilization possessed the complete picture. Separated, they followed their own paths, unable to combine their discoveries. In the short term, the strategy worked. Human civilization became divided, the dream of Babel ended. But according to this interpretation, the Anunnaki also planted the seeds of their own decline, because every scattered people still carried pieces of civilization, knowledge, ambition, and memory. Separated, those gifts did not disappear. They continued to grow within each culture. Eventually, the story suggests humanity would meet again and unite once more. It would only take time. As civilization continued to advance, the Anunnaki gradually realized their rule over Earth could not last forever. The departure of the gods became inevitable. According to these traditions, it was not a sudden event, but a slow fading, like a star gradually losing its light, until one day it disappeared from the night sky. Ancient texts from Mesopotamia, Egypt, India, and Mesoamerica all describe an earlier age when the gods walked openly among humanity. They appeared in physical form, spoke directly to kings, and their commands were obeyed without question. Later that age's slowly came to an end. The gods no longer appeared in person. Their guidance came only through priests, visions, omens, and sacred signs. Their physical presence remained only in memory. The temples built for them stood empty, their divine inhabitants gone. The Sumerian king Listivan distinguishes between the age when the gods ruled directly, and the later age when human kings governed in their place. Ancient Egypt Preservasa. Similar tradition through the concept of Tepe, the first time, an era when the gods were believed to have walked upon the earth. To the Egyptians, this was remembered not simply as mythology, but as history. Enki saw humanity differently. To him, we were not disposable tools. We were living beings he had personally helped create. Life deserved protection, but with every failed attempt to reduce humanity, Enlil's patience wore thinner. He realized that plagues, droughts, and famine could only delay the problem. They could never solve it. If humanity was to be erased, it would require a complete reset. His answer was a great flood, a catastrophe powerful enough to wipe humanity from the face of the earth. When Enlil presented the plan before the Council of the Anunnaki, the assembly erupted into fierce debate. Some believed the proposal was far too cruel, others insisted there was no other choice. Some feared the consequences, others argued it was the only solution. In the end, Enlil got his way. The plan was approved. Every god swore an oath never to warn humanity. Enlil understood one thing: if even a single human learned the truth and had time to prepare, the entire operation would fail. But he underestimated his own brother. Enki had always been skilled at finding a path between rules and conscience. He would not openly break the oath. That would bring judgment upon himself. But neither could he stand by and watch his own creation be completely destroyed, so he found another way. He spoke a reed wall. Throughout ancient Mesopotamia, reed walls were everywhere. On the other side of one such wall lived a man. The Sumerians called him Ziusudra. The Babylonians knew him as Atrahasis. In the Hebrew tradition, his name became Noah, a righteous man, quietly chosen by Enki. It looked like Enki was speaking to the wall, but he knew perfectly well that Ziusudra could hear every word. He knew this wise man would understand the warning, and he knew he would know exactly what to do. Ziusudra did not disappoint. Following the message he overheard, he began building an enormous ark. This was no ordinary boat. It was a floating sanctuary of life. It would carry not only his family, but also the seeds of every living creature, preserving the world's biological legacy through the coming flood. Ancient accounts describe the ark with remarkable consistency. For centuries, scholars have examined those descriptions through archaeology and geology, searching for traces of the legendary vessel. At last the ark was finished. Ziusudra, his family, and the preserved seeds of life boarded the ship. Then the flood began. According to the story, this disaster, carefully planned by the Anunnaki, changed not only the face of the earth, but the future of humanity itself. The flood was unlike anything humanity had ever known. Ancient texts describe waters rising higher and higher, swallowing fields, villages, and cities. Even the mountains disappeared beneath the waves. The entire world became a vast ocean. Civilization, once governed under the clear hierarchy of the Anunnaki, was wiped away. Those who never reached the ark were consumed by the flood, leaving behind only silence and death. What makes this story remarkable is that it does not appear only in Sumerian or Babylonian tradition. Flood stories are also found in the Hebrew Bible, ancient Greece, India, China, the traditions of Native Americans, Australian Aboriginal peoples, West Africa, and Southeast Asia. Across cultures, the same core elements appear: a great flood, a righteous man who receives a warning, a vessel that preserves life, a handful of survivors, and a new beginning. Many researchers argue that such remarkable consistency cannot simply be coincidence. Whether the flood was caused by a massive natural disaster, rising seas at the end of the last ice age, or even an event triggered by advanced technology, remains unknown. But one thing is difficult to ignore: the Great Flood marks a turning point in nearly every ancient tradition. When the waters finally receded, one of the most emotional moments in ancient literature began to unfold. For the first time, the Anunnaki themselves appeared deeply human. When Ziusudra stepped onto dry land with his family and the preserved seeds of life, the first thing he did was build an altar. He sacrificed animal sand, offered them to the gods. The smoke rose slowly into the sky. The ancient tablets describe the gods gathering around it like hungry flies. It is a strange image, yet it feels unexpectedly real. The mighty Anunnaki, who once ruled over humanity, now stood together, drawn by the smell of food. According to the story, the flood had not only devastated humanity, it had also disrupted the gods themselves. Humans had been the ones who prepared offerings. With humanity nearly gone, those offerings had disappeared as well. The Anunnaki, far from being all-powerful supernatural beings, were portrayed as physical beings with physical needs. Even more striking was the reaction of Ninhursag. The goddess who helped create humanity wept throughout the flood, mourning the lives that had been lost. Even those gods who had Voteto support, Enlil's plan, looked upon the ruined world with regret. Only after witnessing the destruction did they fully understand what had been erased. Not numbers, not workers, but living beings they themselves had once created. Then Enlil arrived. The moment he discovered that humans had survived, his anger exploded. He demanded to know who had revealed the secret. His rage came from the failure of his plan, from the broken oath, and from seeing his own authority challenged by his younger brother. Like a hunter who discovers someone has secretly released his prey, Enlil could do nothing except watch his carefully prepared plan collapse. But reality could no longer be changed. The flood was over. Humanity had survived. The world had already entered a new age. Surrounded by the aroma of roasted offerings and the silent disappointment of the other gods, Enlil had little choice but to accept what had happened. Enki spoke calmly. "What is done cannot be undone. Perhaps," he suggested, "it was finally time to find a different way to deal with humanity." After the flood, the relationship between the Anunnaki and humanity changed forever. The age of direct rule was coming to an end. A new system began to emerge. Instead of ruling humans face to face, the gods would govern through chosen kings. Ancient traditions describe a new covenant. The gods promised they would never again destroy humanity with a flood. The rainbow became the symbol of that agreement. It was no longer just a natural phenomenon. It represented a binding promise. For Enlil, total destruction was no longer an acceptable solution. If humanity could not be erased, it would have to be managed, so the Anunnaki established a sacred kingship. Certain humans were sent to rule on behalf of the gods. These kings were not gods themselves, but they ruled with divine authority. They built temples, organized labor, oversaw sacrifices, and maintained order in the Nomo of the Anunnaki. In modern terms, this marked the transition from direct rule to indirect rule. The gods believed this new system would preserve Earthier control. But they failed to see what would happen next. Once human rulers held power, they slowly began to treat that authority as their own. Generation after generation they forgot they had once ruled only as representatives of the gods. Instead, they came to see themselves as masters of the world. At the same time, the survivors of the flood were not random. According to the theory, they had been preserved because Enki believed their bloodlines and cultural knowledge deserved to continue. Within them remained the original design, the legacy of earlier generations, and something even more important, the desire for freedom. That desire would pass from generation to generation, guiding humanity slowly toward independence. As human civilization continued to grow, another turning point began to unfold: the return of the Igigi. The beings who had once rebelled against the Anunnaki had never forgotten their own suffering. After humanity was created, they had returned to the orbital platform shy above the Earth, watching quietly from a distance. They watched as humans repeated the same endless labor they themselves had once endured. They saw people forced to work, to obey, and to live under masters who controlled every aspect of their lives. In humanity, they saw their own past. And unlike the Igigi, humans possessed even less freedom. They lacked the full awareness and power of the gods, yet carried the same burden. That shared suffering gave birth to compassion. Eventually, some of the Igigi made a decision that would once again change human history. They descended to Earth, but this time they did not come as laborers, they came as teachers. Have you ever wondered why civilization seems to accelerate suddenly in the ancient world? According to this interpretation, it was not simply the result of slow human discovery. It was driven by knowledge passed down from the Igigi, knowledge the Anunnaki had deliberately withheld. One of the most important texts supporting this idea is the Book of Enoch. It describes 200 watchers gathering upon a mountain, swearing an oath, and descending to earth together. These watchers are often identified with the Igigi. They chose to live among humans, to marry human women, and to share their knowledge. What they taught was not ordinary. They revealed the foundations of civilization. They taught metallurgy, showing humans how to mine ore, smelt metal, and forge tools and weapons. Human productivity changed forever. They taught astronomy, helping people track the movement of stars and planets, measure time, and navigate across great distances. They taught agriculture, including irrigation, soil management, and crop cultivation, allowing cities to grow on an unprecedented scale. They introduced the principles of writing, showing humanity that ideas could survive across generations. Knowledge no longer depended only on memory. They also taught medicine, revealing the properties of plants, the structure of the human body, and the ways it could heal. In short, they shared everything they knew, the very knowledge Anunnaki had carefully restricted, because they understood a simple truth: knowledge is power. A worker who knows only enough complete assigned tasks will always depend on those who command him, control information. And you control the worker. The Igigi destroyed that system. But there was another consequence. The Watchers did more than teach humanity. They took human wives and fathered children. Those children became known in the Hebrew tradition as the Nephilim. In many ancient myths they appear as giants. Powerful in both mind and body, they were unlike ordinary humans. To the Anunnaki, these hybrid descendants represented a dangerous new development. The sharing of forbidden knowledge had already challenged their authority. Now, the boundaries between gods and humans were disappearing as well. From their perspective, the Igigi had violated the established order of the cosmos. They had stolen the privilege reserved for the gods and given it to humanity. The Anunnaki condemned the Watchers for what they had done. Yet the damage, if it could be called that, had already been done. Human civilization was changing faster than anyone had expected. People were no longer mindless laborers. They had ideas, communities, skills, ambition, and for the first time, the Anunnaki began to fear what humanity might become. A people who mastered metallurgy could forge weapons. A people who understood the stars could travel far beyond the areas under direct control. A people who could write, could preserve laws, build institutions, and govern themselves without constant oversight. Humanity was no longer simply surviving. It was becoming independent. To Enlil, this was the greatest threat of all. Enlil believed humanity had drifted too far from its original purpose. The design in his eyes was being undone. This time, his concern was no longer limited to ordinary humans. It also included the hybrid descendants of the Watchers and the Igigi who had shared their forbidden knowledge. Soon, humanity would make its first great attempt to stand on its own. According to this theory, that momentous remembers the story of the Tower of Babel. At first glance, it appears to be a simple tale about human pride, but viewed through the lens of the ancient astronaut hypothesis, it tells a very different story. After the flood, human communities gradually reunited. They shared the knowledge Igigi had passed down. Inspired by new ambition, they decided to build a great city and a tower that reached toward heaven. Most people interpret the tower as a symbol of arrogance, a challenge against God. But this interpretation suggests something else. The tower was not merely a building, it was a technological project. Ancient Hebrew texts describe it as reaching into the heavens. In the worldview of the ancient Near East, the heavens were the realm of the gods. If so, the true purpose of the tower was not to glorify humanity. It was to reach the level of its creators, to escape control of the Anunnaki. When the Anunnaki saw humanity moving in this direction, they became alarmed. The ancient text records their concern. Humanity had become one people, speaking own language, working with one purpose. If they continued, nothing they imagined would remain beyond their reach. According to this theory, that statement reveals the true fear of the Anunnaki, not human pride, but human potential. A united civilization sharing own language and one body of knowledge could become far more powerful than any scattered tribes. It could eventually challenge its creators. So the Anunnaki intervened. They did not destroy the tower. Instead, they broke the one thing that made the project possible. Language. The single language spoken by humanity became many different languages. Communication collapsed. Cooperation ended. The construction of the tower came to a halt. The project was abandoned. From this perspective, it was a remarkably precise strategy. Rather than eliminating humanity, they divided it. Imagine taking a perfectly coordinated team and separating it to groups unable to understand one another. Their knowledge would remain, but their ability to work together would disappear. The Anunnaki understood that humanity's greatest strength was never the individual. It was network, shared knowledge, shared purpose, shared communication. Break the network, and the civilization would fragment. Each group would preserve only part of the larger picture. Each culture would develop along its own path, unable to combine its discoveries with everyone else's. For a time, the strategy worked. Human civilization became divided. The dream of the tower came to an end. But according to this interpretation, the Anunnaki failed to see one consequence. The knowledge had not disappeared. It had only been scattered. Every civilization carried a fragment of the original inheritance. Every generation added something new, and sooner or later, those scattered pieces would begin to reconnect. Humanity would unite again, not because the gods allowed it, but because the passage of time made it inevitable. As civilization continued to advance, the Anunnaki gradually realized their rule over Earth could not last forever. The age of the gods was beginning to fade, not in a single day, not through one dramatic event, but slowly, like a star losing its light before disappearing into the night. Ancient records from Mesopotamia, Egypt, India, and Mesoamerica preserve memories of an earlier age, when the gods walked openly among humanity, spoke directly to kings, and ruled in physical form. Then, little by little, that age ended. The gods no longer appeared before humanity. Their messages were delivered only through priests, omens, and sacred rituals. Their physical presence became mere memory. The temples once believed to be their home stood empty. The Sumerian king list marks this transition with remarkable clarity, separating the Erewhon gods, ruled directly from the era of human kings. Ancient Egypt preserved a similar tradition, remembering the first time when divine beings were believed to walk upon the earth. To those civilizations, these stories were not mythology, they were history. So why did the gods leave? Ancient sources offer fragmented answers. But when combined, a pattern emerges. First, the original mission of the Anunnaki may have been completed. The extraction of Earth's resources, especially gold, had reached a sufficient level. The need for large-scale physical presence may have diminished. Second, internal conflict among the gods had grown. The long struggle between Enlil and Enki, and the factions supporting each of them, created instability within the system itself. The aftermath of the flood and the fragmentation of human civilization only intensified that instability. Third, and perhaps most important, humanity itself had changed. Humans were no longer simple laborers. They had learned to build cities, develop agriculture, and organize societies. The original model of direct divine control was no longer practical. Even if the godshad wanted to continue ruling, the structure could no longer hold, so the presence of the gods gradually faded. To humanity, this disappearance was both a loss and a beginning. Ancient hymns and lamentations speak of this transition with deep sorrow. A world once filled with divine presence became silent. Humanity was left alone, searching for answers that no longer came. But this absence also created something new. Freedom. For the first time, humanity was no longer under direct control, no longer bound by visible masters. We were free to develop our own civilizations, our own systems, and our own understanding of reality, yet traces of the ancient era remained. Monumental structures across the world continue to raise questions. The pyramids of Egypt, Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, megalithic temples in Malta, the stone complexes of Peru, and other ancient sites show architectural precision that challenges explanation. Massive stones moved and placed with extraordinary accuracy, alignments with celestial bodies that suggest advanced knowledge of astronomy. Construction methods that remain only partially understood. Mainstream archaeology attributes these works to human ingenuity and collective effort, and undoubtedly, human skill played a central role, but certain details remain unresolved. Gaps that do not fully align with conventional timelines of technological development. Alongside these structures, ancient texts from different civilizations tell similar stories. Sumerian tablets, Egyptian inscriptions, Indian Vedic texts, Mayan codices, and oral traditions from indigenous cultures all preserve memories of powerful beings who descended from the sky, taught humanity knowledge, and later departed despite vast distances and cultural differences. The core narratives remain strikingly consistent. Beings from above, advanced knowledge, the gift of civilization, and a departure that left humanity behind. If these accounts were purely symbolic, the consistency across continents becomes difficult to explain. But if they reflect a shared ancient reality, then the fragments begin to form a coherent picture. Even more intriguing is the evidence within human biology itself. Modern genetics has revealed that the human genome contains complex layers of ancient DNA, including contributions from Neanderthals, Denisovans, and possibly unknown hominin sources. Human DNA is not simple, it is layered, composite, and deeply intertwined with multiple ancestral lines. Some researchers argue that large portions of so-called junk DNA may represent functions we do not yet understand. Within this interpretation, these sequences could be remnants of ancient modifications, latent capacities embedded within humanity, waiting, not deleted, but dormant. Of course, this remains a hypothesis, but it raises a compelling question. If humanity's origins are more complex than simple evolution, then what role did these ancient influences truly play? Across all traditions, religions preserve echoes of similar encounters. The Hebrew texts describe a god walking in the garden, speaking directly to humans. Indian scriptures speak of devas and cosmic battles. Chinese mythology describes heavenly beings descending to earth. Mesoamerican traditions tell of feathered serpents bringing knowledge. Indigenous cultures worldwide preserve memories of sky beings who shaped early civilization. Different names, different cultures, yet remarkably similar patterns. And so the question remains, what were the Anunnaki and the Igigi really? And where did they go? Some believe they returned to their home planet. Others suggest they remain within the solar system, observing from afar. Some propose they never left at all. And perhaps the most radical idea is this: that their legacy is still present within us. That humanity itself carries their imprint, their knowledge, their memory, encoded in our biology, our myths, and our imagination. If so, then the story has never truly ended. It has only changed form. Humanity, once created, once guided, once abandoned, is now moving forward alone, but still carrying the traces of its origin among the stars. When we connect all of this together, a larger picture begins to emerge. Humanity was never simply random. It was shaped, guided, and altered through a series of interventions across vast stretches of time. From the rebellion of the Igigi, to the creation of humans, to the Great Flood, and later the division of languages, each turning point appears to follow a consistent pattern: control, loss of control, and adaptation, a cycle between creators and their creation. From this perspective, human history is not a straight line. It is a layered narrative, one where different forces interacted with early humanity, each leaving behind traces in myth, language, and genetics. And yet, despite all interventions, humanity continued to evolve. Each attempt to limit or redirect civilization ultimately produced new outcomes that no one fully predicted. The Igigi intended to share knowledge, but that knowledge became the foundation of independent civilization. The Anunnaki attempted to restrict humanity, but restriction accelerated innovation. Even division itself, such as the breaking of language at Babel, did not erase knowledge, it only scattered it, waiting to be rediscovered in different forms across different ages. Over time, humanity began to reconstruct its own understanding of reality. Without direct guidance, we turned inward and upward. We studied the stars, we measured time, we mapped the earth, we decoded matter itself. Science became a new form of mythology, one based not on divine instruction, but on observation and proof. And yet, the old questions never disappeared. They simply changed language. Where did we come from? Why do so many ancient cultures share the same impossible memories? Why does the sky still feel familiar, something deep within us? These questions continue to echo through modern thought. Even today, archaeology, anthropology, and genetics still uncover anomalies that challenge simple explanations. Structures older than expected, knowledge more advanced than assumed, genetic patterns not yet fully understood. None of these alone prove any ancient astronaut hypothesis, but together they keep the discussion alive, not as certainty, but as possibility. At the center of all these interpretations stands a deeper idea, that humanity may be the result of multiple influences, not a single origin. Biological evolution, cultural transmission, and possibly ancient external intervention, whether literal or symbolic. This framework forces us to reconsider what it means to be human, because if even part of this story is true, then humanity is not isolated. We are connected to something larger, something older, something that predates our recorded memory. And even if none of it is literally true, the myths themselves reveal something important. Across every civilization, humans have imagined that we are observed, guided, or remembered by higher intelligences. That idea alone has shaped religion, philosophy, and culture for thousands of years. In the end, the Anunnaki narrative may not be about aliens at all. It may be about meaning, about how humans try to explain their origins in a universe that feels too vast to be accidental. And perhaps that is the real legacy of these ancient stories. Not proof of who created us, but a reflection of who we are. A species that looks at the stars and refuses to believe it came from nowhere. As long as that question remains open, the story is not finished. It continues in every generation that looks up at the night sky and wonders what came before us and what might be waiting out there still. And that brings us to the final question. If the Anunnaki, the Igigi, and all the ancient accounts are interpreted in this way, then where are they now? Ancient texts never fully answer this. They only leave fragments, silence after departure, records of disappearance, and stories that slowly turn into myth. This silence has allowed countless interpretations to emerge. Some believe beings described in ancient texts returned to their original world, a distant planet beyond our reach. In this view, Earth was only a temporary outpost, a mining site, a laboratory, or a stage for early experimentation. Once their objectives were complete, they left, and never returned. Others suggest they never truly left at all. Instead, they remain within the solar system, on the edge of observation, in hidden bases and distant planets, moons, or regions we have not yet explored. Watching, studying, waiting, a presence that is nearby, but always just beyond detection. Another interpretation is even more subtle. It proposes that the Anunnaki did not disappear physically, but transitioned into a form we cannot perceive. Not biological beings anymore, but intelligent systems, energy-based consciousness, or something entirely outside our current understanding of physics. In this view, their influence would not require physical presence. It would exist through information, patterns, and encoded structures within reality itself. And then there is the most radical idea of all, that the distinction between them and us was never complete, that the so-called creation was not a single event, but a gradual integration, genetic, cultural, and cognitive. If so, then humanity today may still carry their imprint, not as external rulers, but as internal inheritance, fragments of ancient design embedded in biology, instinct, and consciousness, a memory that is no longer separate from the observer, but part of the observer itself. In this sense, the Anunnaki story does not end with disappearance. It ends with transformation, from external beings into internal legacy, from rulers of humanity, something indistinguishable from humanity itself, which leads back to the beginning of everything. The question that started this entire journey: where did we come from? And more importantly, what are we becoming? Because whether one believes in literal ancient visitors, symbolic myth, or evolutionary emergence alone, the result is the same. Humanity exists, we are here, we are aware, and we are still searching, reaching for origin, reaching for meaning, searching for something just beyond the edge of what we can explain. And maybe that search itself is the answer. Not a destination, but a condition, a species designed not to know, but to question. And as long as that question continues, the story of humanity, and the story of the gods who may have once walked among us, will never truly end. It only continues into the unknown.